Hi everyone, in this story I'm going to pick up with the aftermath of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. We all know under the Constitution that when a president dies in office he is succeeded by the vice president. In this case, the vice president is Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson was not a Republican, he was a Democrat from Tennessee. So a Democrat from a slave-owning state has now become the president of a Republican administration. Even more problematically for Johnson looking forward was that Johnson very much saw himself in the mode of Andrew Jackson. He was not someone who was seized with promoting equality for whites and African Americans. He was not even particularly interested in ending slavery. He was someone who fought to defend the Union, who was committed to keeping the Union of the United States together. It was why he had fought on the side of the Union. But otherwise, he was committed to states' rights. He was committed to states' rights and reducing or certainly limiting the influence of the federal government. And this is going to put him on a course of opposition with the radical Republicans in the government at this time. We find that these are the two competing visions in the Reconstruction. There's the one vision, which is that of the radical Republicans, that ending slavery is not enough, that the federal government needs to ensure that Southern society is remade so that African Americans are treated equally. There's the other side to this, the Andrew Johnson side, which says ending slavery was enough. For the federal government to go further than this would be for the federal government to be exercising tyranny over the individual states. And so there's this, again, Federalist and Republican debate that's been going backwards and forwards throughout this course, continues here during the period of Reconstruction. Johnson, who is opposed to the radicals, vetoes funding that they were providing for the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was the first federal institution to work directly with individuals rather than through the states. For Johnson, this is an overreach of the federal government's power. And so this is the first opposition we see between Johnson and the radical Republicans. The early elections after the war return, you see all the states for the first time coming since the war are coming back into Congress. All the southern states have representatives in Congress and the Senate. And to the horror of the Republicans, it looks basically the same as it did before the war. That there are a lot of Confederate generals, Confederate politicians, including the vice president of the Confederacy, who have been elected to federal office. And this leads the radical Republicans to say there's a problem here. We've won the war, we've ended the buying and selling of African Americans, but we need to ensure their citizenship. We need to remove these people who are very dangerous from our national political landscape. And so they pass the Civil Rights Act, protection under the law for everyone, regardless of skin color in the United States. And Johnson vetoes this. And then the Republicans in Congress override his veto. This is the first time that this has happened, that Congress has overridden a presidential veto on a major bill. And it's from this point onwards that you see Johnson's authority continue to decline throughout his presidency. And the Republicans re-emphasize the importance of the civil rights legislation by then passing and ratifying the 14th Amendment, which states the same thing. Equal protection under the law for both African Americans and white Americans. Because remember, think back to the Dred Scott decision. Part of the ruling of that decision was that as an African American, Dred Scott didn't even have the rights to sue in a federal court. And so that's part of what the 14th Amendment is establishing. And so now that Johnson's authority has been weakened and Congress is kind of controlling the government of the United States at this time, we enter a period that's known as the period of the Congressional Reconstruction. a period during which we see the radical Republicans driving a Reconstruction program that emphasizes much more the role of the federal government. And so instead of having states sending their representatives to Congress, instead we see Congress establishing military governments and military occupation of the southern states. This is really horrifying, even to people who had supported the Union during the war. This seems to be going too far. This seems to be establishing a federal government that will totally absorb and obscure each of the individual states. And Johnson tries to resist this. When he does try and resist this, the Republicans try and impeach him. And so we have the first impeachment trial of an American president. And Johnson's impeachment fails by one vote by a Republican senator who was not convinced that Johnson was overreaching the bounds of his office and subsequently saw his career disintegrate and died in poverty. Whether or not you agree with this senator, Senator Ross, that Johnson deserved to be impeached, it certainly shows that there were people within the United States government at the time who were willing to risk their careers in order to stand on the principle of due process and the presumption of innocence. So now we come to the status of African Americans in the post-war South. We find that after the passing of the 15th Amendment, which is the next of these great amendments that follow the Civil War, 15th Amendment to the Constitution guarantees them the right to vote. Republicans encourage them to do so, and they become very committed voters, most of them Republican. So they are participating as citizens in the election processes of the United States, but they're also extremely poor and they have no land. And there are very few banks that are willing to show the confidence in a former slave of granting them a loan in order to buy land. And so most of them end up in what becomes known as the sharecropping system, which is sort of the new mass labor system that emerges in the South. And it looks kind of like the encomienda system in the Spanish New World. And that's kind of the point that these former English colonies have reached by this stage, that the landholder will provide seed, land, tools, and then if you're a former slave or you don't own land, you go to work with the tools and the land and the seed that you've been given, and then at the end you receive a share in the crop. So you're not even being paid in cash. It's even the workers have even less autonomy than in the encomienda system, where they would at least receive a wage. And so they're very much tied to the land. If they leave the land during the harvest season, they won't, of course, receive a share of the crop. They're seen as breaking their contract with the landowners. So African Americans have certainly, their position has improved in terms that they have more freedom than they did as slaves and during the Civil War. But their freedom is still very much limited. And in terms of their material lives, they're actually in many instances poorer because they have more responsibilities, more economic responsibilities. They have to find housing, they have to find food, and it's no longer part of the responsibilities of their employers. At least that's how many of these employers saw it, to provide them with food and housing, which at least they had received as slaves. So their main improvement in life at this time is that they can vote, and they participate in these Republican administrations in the South, these military governments established by the radical Republicans. And although these administrations in the South, these Republican administrations in the South, will end up being voted out of office in the mid-1870s, they nevertheless do significantly impressive work providing the infrastructure and the education to begin to put the southern states back together again after the devastation that we see in these areas after the Civil War. And through the passing of the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, they provide the foundation for further civil rights movements as we move deeper into American history.